Our theme for tonight is the Immaculate Conception. And this material, some of you who came last year diligently will recognize, we'll go through the same material. But I think for most of us it will be helpful to review it. Okay. So we said last time that, last time we looked at Mary as the Mother of God. And we said that Mary's divine maternity is the foundation of all of the other gifts and privileges that Mary received. Right? Every other gift that God gave to Mary, He gave to her to be a worthy Mother of God, to prepare her for being the Mother of God. And the first preparation that He gave her was at the moment of her conception, and that's logical. In other words, He prepared her so perfectly that that preparation began as she first came into existence. In other words, the preparation began at the very moment that God created Mary's soul out of nothing at the moment of conception. Right? And that's what we're going to look at tonight. We call it the Immaculate Conception. And so we'll see, well, what does it mean? And we'll look at the history of it, because it was a somewhat difficult, that's an understatement, history. It was a tortuous history in part. Okay, so let's start by looking at what Blessed Pius IX defined and we believe as a dogma of faith. And so here's the definition that of Pius IX in the bull of 1854 called Ineffabilis Deus. He said, "We declare, pronounce, and define that the doctrine which holds that the Most Blessed Virgin Mary, in the first instant of her conception, by a singular grace and privilege granted by Almighty God, in view of the merits of Jesus Christ," and that's very important, we'll see later, "the Savior of the human race, was preserved free from all stain of original sin, and that this is a doctrine revealed by God, and therefore to be believed firmly and constantly by all the faithful." Right? That's the doctrine. We'll, as we go through the history of it, we'll take it apart. But the key thing is that it was a unique grace to fit her to be the Mother of God, and it was given to her through the merits that her Son merited dying on the cross, which were foreseen by God from all eternity. Okay. Now, this doctrine didn't come to be defined without a long process of debate, controversy, reflection, and discernment of the Church over 15 centuries, we could say, 18 centuries. And we could say that this dogma of the Immaculate Conception is one of the most striking and beautiful examples of a general principle of theology, the development of doctrine. The Church ponders the mysteries. And in the course of pondering century after century, she comes to understand them more fully. Not that there was something lacking in Christ's revelation to the apostles, or the guidance of the Holy Spirit to the apostles. Not that anything was lacking in the deposit of faith. But the Church reflects on those same truths over and over again, just as we reflect on them over and over again. And we have to reflect on these. And that's why the Church gives us a liturgical year, so that we can reflect on the same mysteries, Christmas, the Immaculate Conception, Easter, over and over again. Right? And in the course of that reflection, we come to understand more deeply. And so, in this case, the Church reflected for 18 centuries before the doctrine was finally defined. Right? And Mary is the great example of this, because we saw how Luke emphasizes she pondered these things in her heart. The mysteries, say, of the birth of Jesus, the mystery of Him being lost in the temple. Mary pondered these things in her heart. And so the Church likewise. And in the process of this pondering, some of the greatest theologians, the greatest theologians in the history of the Church, came up short. And that's, in its own way, it's a beautiful thing, because it shows that the mysteries of our faith are so great that no theologian is is fitted to grasp everything. But even in their falling short, they played a role in the church's coming to greater clarity. And that's the way it always is. Even the heretics play a role in this process, despite themselves. Because it's the occasion of the church reflecting more deeply. Now, the principal difficulty that we're going to look at was, how do we reconcile two truths? And the key truth here is the universality of Christ's redemption. How do we reconcile that with a unique holiness of the Mother of God? In other words, how do we reconcile the fact that Christ, the universal Redeemer of all men, with Mary being conceived without sin? It might seem that she wouldn't need her son's redemption. Like, this is the obstacle that the theologians needed to resolve. And another difficulty would be, Scripture seems to imply that all men sinned in Adam. The letter to the Romans, chapter 5. Right? All men have sinned in Adam. And Luke 5:32, Christ came not to call the just, but sinners to repentance. Okay. Now, this question of Mary's Immaculate Conception wasn't posed directly and explicitly in the entire first millennium. But we'll see, many theologians had beautiful things to say about it. But it wasn't posed as a question. Was Mary conceived at the first instant of her conception? Was she sanctified at the first instant? Or was she sanctified later in her mother's womb? It was first posed in the 12th century. But what do the fathers... the fathers still have a lot to say about this, but more indirectly, or not entirely explicitly. And we first encounter it in the fathers in their understanding of Mary as the new Eve. Right? So the fathers make this beautiful comparison, we've looked at it in earlier talks, between the first Eve and Mary as the new Eve, just as Adam is a figure of Christ, the new Adam. And so a couple brought about our fall, and so it's fitting that there be a new Adam associated with a new Eve in bringing about our rise. Now, when the fathers developed the analogy, that it's an analogy by opposition. What Eve lost through disobedience, the new Eve gains through obedience and faith. But the logic is this, that in order for the new Eve to recover what the first Eve lost, the new Eve can't be less well endowed than the first Eve. In other words, the first Eve was given a task to be faithful to a gift. The second Eve has to cooperate in recovering a gift that's been lost. And which is harder? To conserve a gift received or to recover a gift that's been lost? Obviously, it's more difficult, immeasurably. No, we know that from human experience. It's so much harder to rebuild, than simply to conserve what's already built. It's easy to destroy, right? But it's hard to rebuild. And so, if Eve, the first Eve, had to be beautifully endowed for her mission, which was to be faithful, to retain the gift given. And how was she endowed? Well, she was created how? She was created in grace, as was Adam. Now, Adam and Eve were both created, not simply as we're born today, but they were created with sanctifying grace and with many other gifts: immortality, lack of suffering, and what we call integrity, the lack of concupiscence. Right? So Adam and Eve had this lack of concupiscence, integrity, immortality, impassibility, infused knowledge, and, most importantly, sanctifying grace. And God made them that way so that they would be fittingly equipped to conserve the gift and pass it on to their children and their children's children. Right? So the new Eve has far greater task to participate in winning back the gift lost, and so she should be more perfectly endowed, not less. But let's suppose she was born in original sin, like all the rest of us. Conceived in original sin, like everyone else. She would have been less well endowed than Eve, and much less well, right? Because Eve was made innocent and immaculate and graced from the beginning, until she, by her own free will, let Satan in. Okay, this parallel is beautifully sketched out by now blessed John Henry Newman in a letter that he wrote to a friend of his. They were both, Cardinal Newman and his friend Pusey, were both pioneers in the Oxford movement, which was a movement to make the Anglican Church more Catholic, they thought, with a small c. In other words, to recover the tradition of the fathers within the Anglican Church. And Newman, as a result of that, ended up seeing that he had to become Catholic, whereas friend Pusey never saw that, and he remained an Anglican. And one of his biggest problems was this doctrine, the Immaculate Conception. He thought that that was a Roman corruption, that it wasn't contained in the fathers and in the tradition. And so Cardinal Newman wrote a beautiful letter to him explaining that it is there in the fathers, in germ, in seed, precisely in this idea of Mary as the new Eve. And precisely in this comparison, that the new Eve needs to be as well endowed as the first Eve, better endowed. In other words, given more grace. So maybe it's on page 2 of your notes here. He writes, "She holds, as the fathers teach us, Mary, that office in our restoration which Eve held in our fall." Now, what were Eve's endowments to enable her to enter on her trial? Well, she had the grant of a large grace. Sanctifying grace. Right? Now, and then he goes on, "Now, taking this for granted, have you any intention to deny that Mary was as fully endowed as Eve? Is it any violent inference that she who was to cooperate in the redemption of the world at least was not less well endowed with power from on high than she who, given as a helpmate to her husband, did in the event but cooperate with him for its ruin? If Eve was raised above human nature by that indwelling moral gift we call grace, sanctifying grace, is it rash to say that Mary had an even greater grace?" And that gives significance to the angel's greeting, "Hail, full of grace." And then he goes on to explain how that's the right translation, whereas Protestants translate highly favored one. Favored doesn't do justice to the notion of grace here as something inside, an intrinsic gift. Right? Favor could be in the eyes of the one who gives favor, but when the angel salutes Mary, right, he's saluting something that she has, something that transforms her inwardly. Well, if Eve had this supernatural inward gift from the first moment of her personal existence, Cardinal Newman writes, is it possible to deny that Mary too had this gift from the first moment of her personal existence? I don't know how to resist this inference. Well, that's what we mean by the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, that Mary was made simply like Eve was made, not out of Adam's side, but she was made in the same innocent condition. And she was made in the same way that Adam and Eve would have produced offspring if they hadn't fallen. Right? If Adam and Eve hadn't fallen, all of their offspring would have been immaculately conceived. In other words, conceived with sanctifying grace. They wouldn't have needed baptism. And so what the Church believes about Mary is that she was conceived as if she were a daughter of Eve unfallen. And as if she were conceived in Eden before the fall. It wasn't before the fall, it was after the fall, but it was through the merits of Christ on the cross. Okay. So the fathers don't directly say this as clearly as we can today, as Cardinal Newman does. But it's implied in their reasoning about Mary as the new Eve. And then the Fathers also base themselves on a beautiful text of the Song of Songs, which the Church applies to Mary and to the Church. And the text is, "You are all fair, my love." Right? It's the bridegroom speaking to the bride. "You are all fair, my love. There is no flaw in you." And the Latin word is macula, immaculata, right? Without flaw, without stain. Okay, let's look now at some of the great theologians and what they have to say about it in the first millennium. And St. Augustine treats this with regard to the heretic Pelagius. Pelagius held that he denied original sin, in essence, Pelagius. And he held that it was possible through human effort not to sin. In other words, through human effort, one could not only not sin, but could merit heaven. And St. Augustine was the great God-given opponent of Pelagius. And in the course of the controversy, Pelagius brought Mary into it and gave her as an example. Look, she didn't sin. And St. Augustine, if he thought that she did have sin in her, he could have said, well, no, she too is a sinner and needed redemption. But he doesn't say that. He says, well, if it's true that she has no sin, that isn't because she did it by her own effort, but it's because she was given a greater gift of grace. Right, so let's look at the text. He says, "All have sinned except the Blessed Virgin Mary, concerning whom, for the honor of the Lord," in other words, because she's the Mother of God, "I wish no question to be raised at all when we're treating of sins. For how do we know what greater grace of complete triumph over sin may have been given to her, who merited to conceive and bear him who most certainly had no sin?" Now he's speaking here about personal sins, but the principle applies also to the Immaculate Conception, because it's the same idea. It's for the honor of her divine maternity. She was given a grace to never sin in any way, and that's not given to anyone else. It's possible for someone to never sin mortally, but it's not possible for us to never sin venially. Right? We all, the just man sins 7 times a day. We take that to mean venial sin. There are venial sins that escape us without full deliberation, and yet we recognize to be not contrary to God's will. And Mary, we hold, uniquely was given this grace to live her entire life without ever sinning, even venially, or even having an imperfection. And that wasn't through simply her force of will, but it was through a greater grace given to her, and through the fact that she had this gift of integrity, which we don't have, precisely through the Immaculate Conception. Now, St. Augustine doesn't directly go into this, but his argument implies the Immaculate Conception. Right? And it's the same principle. It's to make her a more worthy Mother of God. She was given a unique grace that's not given to anyone else. Okay, let's look at the Eastern Fathers. Now, in the West, because of the Pelagian controversy, the followers of St. Augustine tended to deny the Immaculate Conception to Mary. So after St. Augustine, his followers extended sin to all, and original sin. Whereas in the East, the great controversy was a different one. It was the Nestorian controversy. And so after the Third Ecumenical Council that we looked at last week, that declared Mary as the Mother of God, Marian devotion really took off after Mary was declared the Mother of God. And so it's in the East that we find the Immaculate Conception being defended in the homilies of the Eastern Fathers on the Great Marian Feasts. Right, so let's look at some of that. St. Cyril of Alexandria was the hero of the battle against Nestorius, fighting for Mary being the Mother of God. And he lays down a beautiful principle. Whoever heard of an architect who built himself a temple and then yielded up the first possession to his enemy before he then took possession of it? That would be crazy. But that would have happened if Mary had been conceived in sin. Right? If Mary had been conceived with original sin, like all the rest of us, the first one to have possession of her, in a certain sense, would have been Satan, because she would have been, for a time, without sanctifying grace. And that wouldn't make any sense for God to do that. Right? Even if he had sanctified her in her mother's womb, I don't know, the second day of her existence, as a zygote, I don't know, as an embryo, God still wouldn't have been the first to have possession of her. Right? Whereas if she's immaculately conceived, then God has possession of her from the start. She's his temple from the beginning. Right? She who is to be the ark of the covenant. Now, again, he doesn't apply directly to our question, but the principle is there. It's interesting that the Marian doctrines grow above all in the liturgy, and it's in the Eastern liturgy that gradually Marian feasts are added. So the first Marian feast was Christmas, but then 3 more were added in the 6th century. The Annunciation, Mary's birthday on September 8th, and Mary's Dormition, which we'll look at next week, on August 15th, which went together with her Assumption into heaven. And then in the following century, in the 7th century, a 4th Marian feast was introduced on December 9th or December 8th, which was the conception. It was originally called the Conception of St. Anne. In other words, Anne and Joachim's conception of Mary. And it was put on that date to make it 9 months before her birthday, September 8th. And the Eastern Fathers, especially in their homilies on these Marian feasts, and on September 8th or on December 8th, they start from Mary's privilege of being the Mother of God, and they infer from that her unique sanctity, which must have been from the beginning. Right? So that's the logic. Let's look at Saint Sophronius. Saint Sophronius was Patriarch of Jerusalem in the 7th century. And in his homily on the Immaculate Conception, he writes, I believe that God the Word, the only Son of the Father, descended into our lowliness, becoming incarnate, entering the inviolate womb, resplendent with virginal purity of the holy and radiant Mary, who was full of divine wisdom, and free from all contamination of body, soul, and spirit. Right? In that sense, immaculate, free from any stain, any sin. For this purpose, a holy virgin is chosen and sanctified in soul and body. And thus, because pure, chaste, and immaculate, she is able to serve in the incarnation of the Creator. And then he also writes, many saints appeared before you, but none was as filled with grace as you. No one has been purified in advance as you have been. And the meaning of that purified in advance is purified in her mother's womb. Right? He doesn't say directly that she was purified in the first instant, but she was purified in advance. And more than any other saint, John the Baptist was likewise purified in advance at the time of the visitation. But Mary was more purified more in advance. Okay. St. Andrew of Crete, another great Byzantine Eastern father, in a homily on the Nativity of Mary, September 8th, he writes, "Today, Adam presents Mary to God as the first fruits of our nature." It's a beautiful idea. It's that because of the fall, human nature has come into this world not as God originally intended it to. And so Mary is the first fruit. She's the one who has come into this world the way God originally intended all to come into this world. Right? So the first fruits of human nature. Today, humanity recovers the gift it had received when first formed by divine hands in Eden. Right? In Mary, in Anne's womb, humanity recovers that original privilege that it had in Eden of being made in grace. Returns immaculate to its original nobility. The shame of sin had cast a shadow upon the splendor and charm of human nature. But when the mother of Him, who is beauty itself, the mother of Christ, is born, the mother of God, this nature recovers in her person its ancient privileges. In other words, it's as if we're going back into Eden in Mary's conception. Nature recovers its ancient privileges and is fashioned according to a perfect model, truly worthy of God. And this fashioning is a perfect restoration. This restoration is a divinization. This divinization is an assimilation to the primitive state, the original state. In a word, the reformation of nature begins today. The world which had grown old through Adam's fall undergoes a transformation which is wholly divine and receives the first fruits of its second creation. Right? It's in anticipation. Obviously, it's in anticipation of the incarnation. But that anticipation already begins with Mary's conception. Right? So Mary's spoken of as the morning star who goes before the dawn. Right? Her son's conception is the dawn, but Mary's conception is the morning star before the dawn, heralding that dawn and preparing for it already. Right, what a beautiful idea! A return to nature's original privilege. Right? And so it means, so nature had grown old in Adam's fall, and it becomes young again in Mary's conception. Right? Returning back to the beginning, but a better beginning, because Christ merits for us a better grace. Right? Where sin abounds, grace superabounds. Okay, St. John Damascene, the last of the great Eastern Fathers, generally considered the last father of the Church, expresses the same general idea, likewise in a homily on the Nativity of Mary. O happy loins of Joachim, who have produced a germ, a seed which is all immaculate. O wondrous womb of Anne, in which an all-holy child slowly grew and took shape. Right? And the idea is all holy from the beginning. He doesn't directly say it, but... And he refers to Mary as a lily growing amidst thorns, and holds that she was immune to the attacks of concupiscence. Right? Well, concupiscence comes to us from original sin. And so all the fathers hold that Mary would have been immune to that, which is makes sense if she was immaculately conceived. Another Eastern Father, St. Theodore of Studium, Theodore the Studite, speaks of Mary as follows. The Creator Himself made from the old earth a new heaven. What a beautiful idea. From the old earth, because from the line of Adam, from the line of our fallen race, He made a new heaven and a throne that defies the flames. He transformed the old image of man in order to prepare a new all-heavenly dwelling for the Word. Right? So already in Mary, the human nature is made new, as it were, but precisely to be a preparation for the incarnation, for her Son. And he doesn't say it, but through the merits of her Son. He says again, she's the new dough remade by God, the first fruits of the human race. The root of that stem spoken of by the prophet, that would be the stem of Jesse. And we could go on and on. The Photius, the author of the Eastern Schism, Patriarch of Constantinople in the 9th century, refers to Mary in the same way. Forever virgin, unblemished daughter of our race, chosen alone as bride for the absolute King and Lord of all, furnace forged by God, in which the Creator, having leavened anew our nature, has cleansed us of our sour and distressing staleness, etc. So, his disciple continues this, interpreting the Song of Songs, saying, she is beautiful by nature. There's no stain in her. It's from the Song of Songs. She was a closed garden, and we saw that refers to her virginity, a garden enclosed. But it also refers to her purity from sin, inaccessible to sinful thoughts. One could not find in her glorified body the least vestige of the corrupt clay, purified of all human passions. And again, that's the idea that she didn't have concupiscence. She had the gift of integrity. The heavenly food which the Virgin received, that would be the Eucharist, enriched her with divine grace, but did not bring about a cleansing from sins in her, because she who partook of it had no sins. The sacraments that Mary would have received would have increased sanctifying grace in her as in us, but they wouldn't have had the effect that they have in us to purge us from sin. Right? They would just have added grace. Okay, so Byzantine, the Eastern Fathers view Mary, in essence, as paradise regained, but precisely to be the seedbed, the garden, for the incarnation. To make her fit to be that divine furnace in which the incarnation will take place. Now, unfortunately, many Orthodox theologians today have lost that same awareness of Mary's Immaculate Conception that we see in this earlier development. And that's, I think, recent. That's in the last couple centuries in reaction to the dogma of Mary's Immaculate Conception. So in the 19th and 20th centuries. But so many great Eastern Fathers explain this in the preceding centuries. So unfortunately today it's often looked at as an obstacle to reunion. But I think by going back to the Eastern roots, it's so beautiful that this dogma came about, above all, through that Eastern participation, that time in which the Church was breathing through both lungs. Okay, let's look now at the West. Now we saw how because of the Pelagian controversy, emphasis was put on a universality of sin and the need for redemption. And so the Western theologians have that perhaps more prominently in mind, the universal need for Christ's redemption. And this becomes an obstacle with regard to the Immaculate Conception. But it first entered into the West liturgically, because it was a feast day in the East. No, it was actually a holy day of obligation, December 9th or December 8th. And when it came into the West, it came through the Byzantine South Italy. Southern Italy was Byzantine Rite, and so they celebrated these feasts. And there were many religious who took the feast also to other parts of the West. And so we find it in England in the 11th century, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. And then it found its way into France. And at that point, when it was being celebrated in France in the 12th century, St. Bernard opposed it. We'll see, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Before that, let's look at St. Anselm, the greatest theologian of the of the late 11th and early 12th century. So St. Anselm, he doesn't directly hold the Immaculate Conception, but he lays down the principles that will lead to it. And one of those principles is this, that it's a fittingness. It is fitting that the Virgin should be resplendent with a purity such that none could be conceived more perfect save God alone. And it is fitting that the Mother of God be endowed more perfectly than anyone else except her Son, except God. And therefore she has to be better endowed than all the angels, better endowed than Adam and Eve, better endowed than all the saints. Well, if we really consider that, it's obvious that that must imply her Immaculate Conception. Because she wouldn't have been more perfectly endowed than Eve if she were conceived in sin. She wouldn't be more perfectly endowed than the angels. But nevertheless, he didn't draw the conclusion. But one of his disciples, disciple and biographer, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Eadmer? Ryan, do you know? Eadmer? Eadmer of Canterbury, became the leading defender of the Immaculate Conception. And other people in Anselm's circle also started defending this doctrine. And they also started championing its liturgical celebration. So this disciple of St. Anselm writes, "Who dares to say that the most sweet resting place of the Son of God was deprived of the grace of the Holy Spirit in the very beginning of her conception? If there was something of original sin in her generation, it was in those who conceived her," in other words, Anne and Joachim, "and not in the offspring conceived. You came forth from the root of Jesse, untainted by any sin." Right, so right there, he's directly defending the Immaculate Conception. Right, so he's the first explicit Western defender of this doctrine. And what he's explaining here is that we have to distinguish two senses of conception. There's an active conception, that's the conjugal act of the parents. And then there's what we could call passive conception, that's God's making the soul. And in our the active conception of our parents is irrelevant to this passive conception by which God creates the soul either with original sin or without it. And this is something that hadn't been realized so clearly before. Theologians like St. Augustine tended to assume that precisely the fact that we experience concupiscence in the conjugal act was what transmitted original sin to the offspring. And that's not right. Original sin is transmitted simply through human procreation, independently of whether we experience concupiscence in it or not. And it's transmitted because that's the law of the debt of original sin as a punishment for Adam's sin. In other words, it was given to Adam, if he had been faithful, to transmit grace directly to the offspring, such that the conjugal act would have been in Eden the primordial sacrament. Right? It would have transmitted grace and been a sacrament of the divine love. But because of the original sin, that was lost. And so the conjugal act no longer transmits grace. It simply transmits nature. And that's what we mean by the transmission of original sin. Nature is transmitted in human procreation, but without the gift of sanctifying grace and the gift of integrity and immortality. Now God could simply supply it, that grace. But he doesn't, in the ordinary course of things, out of fidelity to the plan of punishment for Adam's sin. Okay? So this theologian, Eadmer, is distinguishing the active conception of Anne and Joachim, which is normal, like other conjugal acts of other couples, but God's contribution is different. In other words, in Mary's conception, God could have supplied what he doesn't supply in all the rest of us because of Adam's sin. In other words, Mary would have been generated through the normal conjugal act of her parents, but God would have intervened at the moment of conception by giving the gifts of original justice in the same way that he would have given them to Adam and Eve's offspring if they had never sinned. Right? So it's as if in Mary's conception, she received the gifts that God intended to be given to all in Eden, right? If Adam and Eve were faithful. So even though Mary is conceived of parents banished from Eden, she was still treated by God, as if she were a daughter of Eve unfallen. That's the idea. And then this theologian poses the question, how can we reconcile that with what St. Paul says, that all have sinned in Adam? And so he says, well, that teacher of truth says that all sinned in Adam. This is true. It's sinful to contradict it. But when I consider the eminent degree of grace in you, I see you not among, but above all created things except for thy Son. And I believe that in your conception, you are not bound by the law of nature of others. In other words, God, when he lays down a law that's in the ordinary course of things, just like the laws of gravity or the laws of nature, God's not bound by them, right? And that's why he can work miracles. And nor is he bound by this law of the universal debt of original sin. And he could make an exception, obviously not arbitrarily, but this is anything but arbitrary. It's for the greatest purpose that could be conceived, to make his mother a fit dwelling place for the Word incarnate, such that she was never possessed, as it were, by the enemy of the human race. Okay, so since God's the author of his laws, he can make exceptions for a reason. And many people in the Enlightenment, many philosophers, deists, argue that God couldn't do miracles because that would be somehow contradicting his own laws. And it's true, God doesn't do arbitrary miracles. But he does miracles for a very good reason, to show the credibility of the Catholic faith. And so this is an even greater reason to prepare Mary to be the mother of God. And then he reasons, well, since God could do this, and since it certainly seems he should have desired to do so, well, he must have done it. He writes, if God gives to the chestnut the possibility of being conceived, nourished, and formed among thorns, and yet preserved from being punctured by them, couldn't he grant to the human body, which he was preparing for himself, to be a temple in which he would dwell bodily, that although she was conceived among the thorns of sin, she might be rendered immune from their pricks? He certainly could, and he desired to do it, and if therefore he willed it, he did it. And we'll see Scotus, the greatest Marian doctor on this question, makes the exact same reasoning 200 years later. And we'll come to this in a minute. But there was a problem. So Ebenmer has laid it out beautifully, but it's better that theologians have a task to play devil's advocate. You have to test things. And so this doctrine got tested in a very harsh manner by the greatest Marian doctor of the age. It's kind of irony. That was St. Bernard. St. Bernard has some of the most beautiful Marian homilies, and he obviously loved Mary incredibly, but he was the one who basically squashed this devotion in its infancy. And it came about, he heard that this was being liturgically observed in France, in the city of Lyon, from which he came. And he wrote a letter to them saying that they shouldn't celebrate the Immaculate Conception because it was contrary to the Church's faith. And this letter ended up having tremendous influence for the next 150 years. And it was the principal reason why later theologians like St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Albert and St. Bonaventure ended up denying the doctrine. So let's read what he says. He writes them, "I marvel exceedingly that some of you should wish to tarnish the luster of your good name by approving a new festival, a rite of which the Church knows nothing, of which reason cannot approve, and which there's no authority in tradition. Are we more learned or more devout than the fathers?" Now, he didn't know that this feast had a very long tradition, but in the East, it had already been celebrated for 7 centuries, or 6 centuries in the Church, and had been a universal feast of obligation in the East. St. Bernard didn't know that. And if he knew it, he certainly wouldn't have argued in this way. If therefore it was quite... and then he goes on to give the reason. And we'll see how his reasoning falls short. He basically gives different alternatives. Could she have been sanctified before her soul was infused into her body? No, because she didn't yet exist. So if it was quite impossible for her to have been sanctified before her conception, because she didn't exist, and he says also it was impossible for her to be sanctified in the act of conception, because he saw that as he was understanding the transmission of original sin to come through the concupiscence experienced in the conjugal act. And so he reasoned, well, she couldn't have been sanctified in the act of conception because that was normal human conception in which there would have been concupiscence. And so the only option is she was sanctified afterwards. Right? So basically that's his... It's wrong, right? The reasoning is wrong because the concupiscence experienced by her parents doesn't have anything to do with the transmission of original sin in reality. But he thought that it did. And then he goes on, if you thought such a feast advisable, you should have consulted the Holy See and not just gone ahead and done it. And of course that would be true today. But in communications were more difficult in the before modern times, and the liturgy grew organically locally. Right? That's a fact. And that's part of the Church's very nature. And then he ends his letter, I've said all of this in submission to the judgment of anyone wiser than myself, and especially in submission to the authority of the Roman Church. To his decision I refer all that I've said on this or any other subject, prepared to modify anything I may have said, if it should be contrary to what she thinks. Right? What a beautiful clause. And this is how theologians should always think. Right? Unfortunately, they don't always think like this. And in this case, St. Bernard was dead wrong, and the Roman Church ruled otherwise, but 7 centuries later. So we can say that St. Bernard was in material heresy, but not formal heresy. Formal heresy is when we're obstinate. We have our own idea, and we're obstinate about it, and Holy Mother Church rules otherwise, and we continue to hold our wrong opinion. Right? That's what we call formal heresy. That's when you can say someone is a heretic. But it happens frequently that we hold wrong opinions, and we think that we're holding what the Church teaches, and in reality, we're not. And we call that material heresy. And it's not a good thing because we're saying something contrary to the truth. And in this case, you can see it had terrible consequences because it held up the right understanding of this doctrine for 150 years or 200 years. And so when we do things in good faith, often, if they're wrong, they have bad consequences in the world, but we're not responsible for that personally. And so that would be the case here. St. Bernard wasn't at fault. He was acting in good faith. But nevertheless, and so we call that invincible ignorance. But invincible ignorance is still a kind of tragedy. Because it means that consequences happen in the world that are tragic because we weren't acting in accordance with truth, even though we didn't realize it. The fact is, though, that all the great theologians, at some point or other, fall into material heresy. And the important thing is that it be only material and never formal. Right? And it's only... What's that? That's right. We always have to think with that close. Maybe we don't have to write it always, but we always better be thinking it. Right? Always prepared to retract our opinions if Holy Mother Church judges otherwise. The Holy Roman Church. The Holy Father and the bishops of the world. Okay. Right. And so I think it's easy to see why he made a mistake. He didn't know about the liturgical development. He didn't know about the tradition. And secondly, he was mistaken about the transmission of original sin. And so because of those two errors, he opposed it. And I think the same thing happens today, that often people misunderstand what's meant by the word conception. And so Cardinal Newman, in his letter that I mentioned before to his friend Pusey, he explains this. He says he thinks that many Protestants deny the Immaculate Conception because they say, well, she was conceived just like anybody else. And that's right. We affirm it. And so Cardinal Newman writes to his friend, the term conception has no reference whatever to her parents, but simply to her own person. It does but affirm that together with the nature she inherited from her parents, her own nature, she had a superadded fullness of grace, and that from the very first moment of her existence. Suppose Eve had stood the trial and hadn't lost her first grace. Suppose she eventually had children. Well, those children, from the first moment of their existence, would, through a divine gift, have received the same privilege that she had, that Eve had had. They would have been conceived in grace, as in fact, we're all conceived in sin. So what's difficult about this? What is there unnatural? Mary may be called, as it were, a daughter of Eve unfallen. You believe with us, and he's saying Protestants believe with Catholics, that John the Baptist had grace given to him 3 months before his birth, when the Blessed Virgin visited his mother. So he wasn't immaculately conceived because he was alive before grace came to him. Right? So John the Baptist wasn't immaculately conceived, but he was immaculately born. Right? He was born holy, and that's why we celebrate his birthday. It's the only saint. We only celebrate the birthday of Christ, Mary, and John the Baptist, because those are the only three that we know of who were sanctified before their birth. And so their birth was holy. And so Our Lady's case only differs by the time, that instead of being sanctified in the womb 6 months after his conception, she was sanctified at the moment of conception. Like Eve. Okay. So let's look now at what happened in the 13th century, the great age of scholastic theology, the great doctors of the church. And the key thing here is that St. Bernard's letter had a tremendous influence. And the great theologians, out of deference to the tradition, tended to follow St. Bernard. So St. Albert, St. Thomas's teacher, denied the Immaculate Conception, but he held that Mary was sanctified in the womb immediately after conception. So it was like, second instant, second moment. So she wasn't immaculately conceived, but she was sanctified right afterwards. So it's not much different. And he likewise held that she was immune from concupiscence and from the other consequences of original sin, such as pain in childbirth that we looked at a couple of weeks ago. St. Thomas, so let's look at St. Thomas Aquinas a little more carefully, because he's the universal doctor of the church. Right? And this is the classic case of an error in St. Thomas. Now, in his first work, when he was a young man in his 20s, the first time that he deals with this question, it seems that he does affirm the Immaculate Conception. But later in the same work, he denies it. So he changed in the course of his first great work. And it seems that the reason for it is he got to know better the letter of St. Bernard. Yeah. So in his very first reference, he says, well, purity is understood by opposition to its contrary. And so he goes through different kinds of purity. He wants to argue that Mary has a maximum purity, second only to God. And that's what St. Anselm had said before. And so he says, well, what would that mean? Something created can be found than which nothing could be more pure if it's not polluted by any contagion of sin. Right? That would be the most pure. If it's never stained by sin. Such was the purity of the Blessed Virgin, immune from original and from actual sin. Right? That's precisely the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. And so St. Thomas affirms it here. Thus her purity was less than God because she could have sinned, but greater than any other because, in fact, she never did sin and she never had any kind of sin, not even original. Right? So that's beautiful. But later in the same work, unfortunately, he retreats from that. And so he says, her parents weren't enabled to conceive their child without original sin, Anne and Joachim. And thus the Blessed Virgin was conceived in original sin, on account of which Blessed Bernard wrote to the canons of Lyon that her celebration is not to be celebrated, though in some churches it is celebrated on account of devotion, not considering the conception, but rather the sanctification. In other words, St. Thomas says it's okay to celebrate December 8th. And because he thought what we're celebrating is her being sanctified in the womb the instant after she was conceived. So we're celebrating her sanctification, not her conception. That's wrong. But that's how he reconciled the liturgical celebration with St. Bernard's letter. And then he poses the question, could she have been preserved from original sin in the instant of creation of her soul, when it was infused into the body? And he says no, because then Mary wouldn't have needed the redemption of her son. Right? So he's added another reason that St. Bernard hadn't mentioned. So he's made the opposition even weightier now, because it's something absolutely central to the Christian faith, the universality of redemption in Christ. So he writes, the sanctification of Mary, of the Blessed Virgin, couldn't have occurred before the infusion of her soul. She didn't yet exist. Nor could it have occurred in the very instant of her soul's infusion, so that she would have been conserved from incurring original sin. For all the members of the human race, Christ alone did not need redemption, because he's our head. All others needed to be redeemed by him. But this could not be the case if there ever was another soul that was never infected by original sin. In other words, if Mary had been conceived without original sin, it seemed to St. Thomas that she wouldn't have needed her son's redemption, because she didn't have anything that needed to be redeemed. Well, that would be a problem. And therefore he concludes, so this privilege wasn't given to her, because it would have detracted from the privilege of her son to be the universal Redeemer of mankind. Right? And so it's a beautiful objection. It's to his credit, because it's the way we have to do theology. We have to put what's most firm and certain first, and then put everything in place. And of course, everything does go in place, but it sometimes may seem that it doesn't. And so what actually was needed here is another mind to look at this and to see how to reconcile these two truths. And it was Blessed Duns Scotus, the great Franciscan theologian, that solves this problem. But St. Thomas couldn't solve it. And so in his later works, he repeats this same argument. So in the Summa of Theology, right, his most famous work, he argues that Mary wasn't immaculately conceived for the same reason. And the reason is, it's beautiful. It's so that she would enter into paradise through the merits of her son. So that all men would enter paradise through the merits of her son. And so he didn't... Now, it's absolutely true that Mary enters paradise through the merits of her son. And she's immaculately conceived. But St. Thomas couldn't see how those two things could go together. And then in the same work, he asks at what moment she was sanctified. He says, well, not before, and not after. And he doesn't even bother to give the alternative of in the moment of the conception. I'm sorry, not before, therefore after. In other words, he makes two possibilities. Was she sanctified before the infusion of her soul? No, she didn't exist. Was she sanctified after? Yes, she must have been, the only other alternative. And therefore, she was sanctified in the womb at some instant after her conception. And he didn't consider the third alternative, sanctified in the very moment, because I think he thought that that would mean that she wouldn't need Christ's redemption. Or else he just didn't think of it. Sorry. So he has a tremendous, St. Thomas has this very high idea of her sanctity. Right? She would have to be sanctified in the second moment, filled with all gifts, be perfectly pure, etc. But nevertheless, he couldn't see how to resolve Christ's universal redemption and the Immaculate Conception. And then he speaks about how should we understand the feast? Well, we celebrate her sanctification, which happened at some unknown time. And so we celebrate it on December 8th. Okay, let's look at St. Bonaventure. St. Bonaventure was a contemporary with St. Thomas, but a Franciscan. And the Franciscans were especially gifted in Marian devotion, but he too denies the Immaculate Conception. But he gives the argument that will then be used by Scotus later. Right? So he speaks about it as the pious opinion, Mary's Immaculate Conception. And so he treats it very sympathetically, but he finally, for the same reason as St. Thomas, he rules that it can't be held because it would detract from Christ's dignity as universal Redeemer. But nevertheless, he understands that if this pious opinion were correct, if Mary were immaculately conceived, Mary still would be preserved by the grace of Christ. And she would have the infection of original sin, not in its effect, but only in its cause. In other words, there would have been a due. It would have been due to her to get original sin, because she was conceived from sons and daughters of Adam. But she would have been spared, she could have been spared the effect of it, even though the due was there. God could have taken away the effect by sanctifying her in that first instant of her conception. So he says this is possible. And then he gives this beautiful analogy. Take two people. It's an example of someone falling into the mud and being rescued, lifted up from the mud. Or someone else being rescued such that they never fall into the mud at all. They're caught in the act of falling, such that they are preserved from actually hitting the mud. Well, which one would be a better rescue? Right? It's obvious. It's much better to catch somebody before they fall in the mud than to pick them up and have to clean them off. And so it would be a greater mercy of God to catch Mary before she fell than to allow her to fall and clean her. Right? It would be a greater mercy. In other words, a better grace. So that's brilliant. Right? That's exactly how we should understand it. That Mary was the recipient of a greater grace, catching her so that she never hit the mud at all. But St. Bonaventure, who gives this beautiful analogy, still thought, but we have to deny it. Even though obviously God could have done this, it would have been a better grace, it wouldn't detract from Christ's redemption, but still, and I guess the reason is that everyone was teaching the opposite in the universities. So he writes this: although reverence and devotion are due to the mother, greater devotion is due to the Son, from whom all her honor and glory comes. Right? That's obviously correct. No, all her glory comes from the fact that she's the mother of God. Since it pertains to Christ's surpassing dignity, that he's the Redeemer and Savior of all, that he opened the door to all, that he alone died for all, the Blessed Virgin is not to be left out of this, for fear that while the mother's excellence was enhanced, the son's glory should be lessened. And so it's the same reason as St. Thomas, even though he'd already given the way out. And then he mentions that in all his time at the universities, he'd never heard anybody defending the contrary. And so that's why he followed suit. Right? Theologians aren't immune from intellectual fashions. Right? Even people like St. Thomas and St. Bonaventure are pretty immune, but they're not totally immune. Anyway, so this glory of defending the Immaculate Conception was left for another theologian, Duns Scotus, Franciscan. And so this is his greatest glory. So let's just summarize his reasoning. God was able to do this. He was able to preserve Mary from falling into the mud of original sin. It was fitting for him to do this, and therefore he did it. And so we have to support the different parts of it. Right? But the general principle is good. No? Whatever course of action reason shows better, well, we can know that God followed it. And that's because of the divine wisdom, that God always does what's most wise, right? Because He's infinitely wise. So if we can see something as wiser, well, God would see that a lot more clearly than us. And so the key problem was to show how it wouldn't detract from Christ's redemption. And so Scotus' argument, no, not only does it not detract from Christ's redemption, it enhances it. It greatly enhances it. Because a perfect redeemer, a perfect mediator, is going to redeem and mediate in the most perfect ways. And in all the ways. In other words, just as God, in creation, He doesn't just create, one level of being, but He creates a whole hierarchy in which there are higher and lower. And so Christ the Redeemer redeems in more than one way. He redeems most of us, allowing us to hit that mud, and then picking us up out of the mud earlier or later in life. Some are baptized in infancy, others are baptized at age 29 or whenever. And so He has all these different grades by which He saves us from that mud. But how fitting it would be that He would also redeem one person at least, in the most perfect way possible. And that would be such that they never hit the mud at all. So a perfect Redeemer would be precisely one who doesn't leave off the most perfect way to redeem someone. And that at least be realized in one member of the human race. And precisely after the Redeemer, the most prominent, the Mother of God. And so it's a beautiful argument. So he writes like this. He says, Mary, let's suppose that Mary's immaculately conceived. If she's immaculately conceived, she would have had greatest need of Christ as Redeemer, not the no need. Right now, St. Thomas and St. Bonaventure were arguing that it would have detracted from Christ's redemption. She wouldn't have needed redemption. And so Scotus says, no. If she's immaculately conceived, she has the greatest need because she's been redeemed in the best way. And she needed it because through her procreation, she would have incurred the debt if something hadn't interfered. Right? Because she was conceived in the normal way of human procreation. She should have received original sin. And therefore, if she didn't, it was only because of a better redemption. Right? And that would be the merit of Christ on the cross. Right? So Mary wouldn't be in less need, she'd be in greater need of a mediator, preventing her from ever contracting sin. Right? It's a simple idea. We've dragged this out. I dragged this out too much, probably. But the idea is very simple. Right? That Christ redeemed her in the most perfect way possible. And therefore, she's the one who most perfectly magnifies Christ's merit on the cross by being conceived in this way. Right? It's the most beautiful fruit of Christ's victory on the cross, Mary's conception. the most perfect fruit. Right? So the Immaculate Conception gives maximum glory to Mary, and also, especially, maximum glory to Christ, the Redeemer. Right? Such that her Son exercises in her the most perfect form of redemption. Now, St. Bonaventure and St. Thomas had warned against giving too much glory to the Mother at the expense of the Son. But that's not what's happening here, right? We're giving glory to the Mother for the exceeding glory of the Son. Right? So it's not only makes her a more fitting vessel for the Incarnation, but it also magnifies the merit of the cross. And in this way, Mary could truly be said to never be in enmity with God. Right? And that was Genesis 3:15 that we looked at various times. Now in Genesis 3:15, God says to Satan, I will put enmity between you and the woman. That enmity would only be perfect if Mary, the woman, the new Eve, never was under the contagion of original sin. Right? And so it's also, it's more scriptural, right, to hold that enmity be perfect than not. All right, so once we establish that the Immaculate Conception is possible, gives more glory not just to Mary, but to Christ, and in two ways, so that he comes into the world in a fitting receptacle, in a fitting ark, but above all, that he magnifies that his redemption not only works in a way that allows us to hit the mud first, but in one worked in such a way as to preserve her from ever being coming under the contagion of sin. Right? And so since this doctrine is most fitting, and God is infinitely wise and powerful, we should hold that God did this. Right? God wouldn't fail to do what's most fitting for his glory. And what would be the maximum communication of his goodness. Right? He doesn't have to give to everyone the maximum communication of his goodness. He doesn't. Right? For example, only one was, he became incarnate only in one humanity. His humanity. But it's fitting that in someone there be a maximum communication of his goodness. That's the fittingness of the Incarnation. And it's fitting likewise that one be redeemed in the most perfect way possible. And that's Mary. Okay. So basically, when Scotus showed, within Scotus, the problem was solved. Right? The problem that had so perplexed St. Thomas, St. Bonaventure, St. Bernard, all the problems, the various problems, have gotten resolved, and it was just a matter of time after Scotus for the dogma to be defined. Of course, we had to wait we had to wait 550 years. But in that time, the liturgical feast spread. Right? So that was the first thing that happened. And the theologians tended to form a consensus around Scotus. The only ones who didn't at first were the Dominicans, for the honor of St. Thomas Aquinas. And so you have to uphold the honor of your order. And some Dominican theologians held out until 1854, but most of them rallied to the Immaculate Conception. And it was made a universal feast in 1477 for the Universal Church. And if the Church proclaims a feast for the Universal Church, no, it's impossible that contain error. It's impossible that the Universal Church worship God wrongly, in a way contrary to the truth of the faith. Right? So at that point already, we could take it as absolutely certain, the Immaculate Conception. Then it was made a universal feast of obligation in 1708. It's the subject of innumerable works of art, especially the great Counter-Reformation artists, Murillo and many other artists. The subject of so many churches and works of devotion. And finally, in the 19th century, after consulting with the Universal and with the bishops of the whole world, Pius IX infallibly defined it in 1854. And 4 years later, it seems as if heaven confirmed that action by in the revelation of Mary to Saint Bernadette at Lourdes in 1858. So just 4 years later, and Mary appeared. We know the story. She first didn't say her name, and Saint Bernadette repeatedly asked her for her name, because the priest had asked her to ask the name of this woman, of this lady who was appearing to her. And finally, she finally said, "I am the Immaculate Conception." And Saint Bernadette didn't have the faintest idea what that meant. Right? She was an uneducated young girl. And the way Mary speaks, it's as if she's given her personal name. I am the Immaculate Conception. As if it was something that defined her essence. And that's absolutely right. No, the Immaculate Conception defined her. It's something that only she received, as the divine maternity defines her. Right? The one chosen to be the temple, never possessed or tainted by the ancient serpent. Right? Fitting her to be the ark of the living Torah and the Word incarnate. Thank you.